Alright, what's going on everybody? Broken Games HDR here. So I wanted to make a video to give people basic hints and tips in regards to the Final Fantasy VII Remake combat system, because at first when you play the game and you experience the combat, it can be very jarring. It could be very uncomfortable, it's not organic, it doesn't feel intuitive. I can assure you that will get better. The more you play the game with time, you will become extremely more comfortable with it, to the point where it's gonna become like you're inputting commands in a fighting game. You're gonna get to the point where you pretty much just go into autopilot, where you don't have to think so much about what you're doing in the game, and you just automatically do it. It becomes muscle memory. And yes, this is from someone who's already beaten the game, and I'm replaying the game on hard. I'm pretty much at the end of the game on hard, so all of this is very natural to me, but I wanted to give people some tips. Now at the gameplay you're gonna see, of course, I'm further in the game. This is New Game Plus, so I've unlocked a lot of techniques, a lot of abilities, a lot of spells and all that stuff, but everything I'm about to say applies to the basic principle of how you should play the game. This game is very much about a rhythm and flow, right? Because before you establish the rhythm and flow, you're kind of like stumbling in the combat, you're like falling over your own feet, but you have to establish a type of combat rhythm. So this is pretty much how I play the game, and how most people who've adjusted to the game and realized they love the combat system, because I was one of those people who loved the original, who before this game came out thought like, oh, they should just keep it turn-based. But once I learned to maximize and optimize the combat system, I absolutely loved it way more than the turn-based original system. So rhythm and flow, you should have a flow of how you go into combat, and this is what I recommend, right? So it should start out with you attacking, you fill the ATB bar, you use an ability, and then you switch a character, rinse, repeat. Attack, fill ATB bar, use ability, switch character. You do that for all the characters in your party. There's some scenarios where you might have, you know, 2 characters. There's some scenarios where you have 3. There's some scenarios where you have 1, but that pretty much still applies. I'll get to some one-on-one situations. So as I said, attack, fill ATB bar, use ability. One of the biggest mistakes I kept on doing very early in the game when I first started is I relied on materia too much. I relied on casting spells too much, because that's a lot of what you did in the original. Do not rely or depend too much on materia. Materia should mainly be used to exploit a weakness, to get around a strength, or used to debuff an enemy or to heal. It should not necessarily be at every point of a combat scenario for you, right? So example, in the gameplay you're going to be seeing, I'm going to head into battle, get into battle with some Shinra soldiers, and this is not necessarily spoilers. You get into battle with Shinra soldiers. What I do with, I start out with Cloud, I attack, I fill the ATB bar, I use an ability, I switch characters. I run into an enemy that has a riot shield. Now you can't attack those type of enemies head on, so I know I have to use some type of elemental magic to get around that. In that scenario, that's when I pretty much have to use magic. But aside from that, I'm using the rinse repeat technique of attack, fill ATB bar, use ability, right? And I also use my magic when my character's health gets too low and then I need to heal. So once again, don't depend on materia. Another tip: do not stick around on one character for too long unless you have a reason to. That's another mistake I made very early on in the game on my first playthrough. I would do a move, I would pretty much stick with that character, keep attacking. No, you are not maximizing your time, you are not maximizing your synergy if you do that. Once you put in a command, move to a different character. Do not stick around unless you, once again, have a valid reason to. Because if you stick around on that character and other characters have their ATB bar filled, it's just sitting there and you're not maximizing all the attacks, all the abilities, all the possibilities that you could be inflicting on the enemy. So unless you, I guess, unless you want to stick around and see those flashy visuals, which, by the way, it's pretty cool if you see it from another character's perspective, and then you start to combine all the different moves, that's better than sticking around on one character just after you perform a move. So you put in the command and you move to another character. Like I said, it's gonna become to the point where you're almost just inputting fighting game commands, right? So don't stick around on another character. My next tip is establish a point character and create a bread and butter flowchart moveset that you're pretty much gonna do each battle, but adjust on the fly based on the circumstances. For example, this is what I do. I start out with Cloud. I attack, triple slash. And once again, these are some abilities you don't get till further in the game, right? So I start with Cloud, I attack, fill the ATB bar, triple slash. I switch to Barret. Overcharge, because a lot of time I believe that's usually filled at the beginning when you start an encounter. So I switch to Barret, overcharge, I use Focus Shot or Maximum Fury. Switch to Tifa, Unbridled Strength, Omni Strike, and I pretty much do that over and over again. Sometimes I use Unbridled Strength, Omni Strike, or her Star Attack. It once again depends on the situation, but you should get into a flow of your bread and butter so you're not going into each encounter unsure of what you're gonna do. Establish your flow chart and the moves that you want to depend on. Like I said, all of this applies to even when you're early on in the game. My next tip is the combat menu. Early on in the game, you can use the L1. Once you're in combat, you can use L1 to pretty much access a quick combat menu. This is case by case basis on the player, but I pretty much stopped using that completely. I think it's just much more fluid, much more intuitive for me to use the combat menu. Obviously, the huge advantage of the combat menu is time slows down immensely. Time slows to a crawl when you go into combat menu. The quick menu with L1 is exactly that. Time doesn't stop. It's just for you to pull out a move very quickly. But especially when you're trying to get used to the combat, use the combat menu, especially for those who were more comfortable or feel like they wanted a turn-based system. This helps the game feel a lot more like a turn-based system. So use the command menu. It'll give you time to think because it slows down time. Like I said, it helps establish that muscle memory. It helps you to navigate and know exactly where all your moves are that you want to access. So trust me, use the combat menu, especially at first. Okay, my next tip is blocking, countering, dodging, and all those evasive maneuvers, right? At first, a lot of people will become very uncomfortable with the combat because they feel like they're always getting hit. Do not become like discouraged if you keep getting hit in the game. It's kind of part of it. I know it kind of messes up the flow, but you kind of just got to get used to being on the offensive. It's not a completely defensive game. It's meant for you to oppress the enemy. That's why you have that's why enemies have pressure statuses or staggered, because it's meant for you to go on the offensive mainly and pressure the enemy or stagger them and stun them. But there are situations where you have to block, right? And blocking doesn't feel completely natural in this game at first, but trust me, sometimes it's just better to block and move to another character than it is to just risk and take the hit. That's one of the scenarios that you'll just learn. It's a case-by-case basis. Obviously, blocking, you still take damage, but it's a lot less damage than you would just taking the hit. There are times when your characters will be pretty much hit with a status ailment. For example, Barret gets put to sleep. If I switch to Barret and I realize he's asleep, don't care, move to another character. He'll snap out of it eventually. There's a status indicator each character's on each character in the bottom right corner that tells you when all of those status ailments are gonna run out. So if your character gets hit with a status ailment, I wouldn't even say it's really worth using an item or using materia to snap them out of that status ailment. In most case scenarios, I think you just focus on the characters that are able to fight. Dodging, the dodging isn't the best in this game, especially with Barret, for example. With Tifa and with Cloud, it's okay, but a lot of attacks are hard to dodge. So like I said, you have to just learn in what cases you should dodge and what cases you should block. When it comes to like one-on-one battles, right? Well, actually, before I get to that, let me just say this. This is a big tip. Enemies will mainly target the character that you are using. That's why it's very beneficial to keep switching characters and not stick to one. But knowing that enemies will mainly target the character you are using, you have to use that to your advantage. For example, Barret is pretty much he's my tank, right? I pretty much, especially in my first playthrough, I've given him stuff like HP up. He has, you know, so he has the most HP out of everybody in my party and everything like that. So he could take a lot more damage. So sometimes what I may do is just attack with Barret, and we know Barret is a ranged character. Keep shooting with Barret until there comes a point in time where the enemy may focus on Barret. Once I know that the enemy is going to do that, I switch to my other characters, and I may cast a spell, for example, that takes some time to cast, because the higher the level of the spell, the longer it takes to cast. So now that I switched from Barret when the enemy is about to attack him, I now know that my next character is safe to fully cast this spell without being interrupted, because your characters can be knocked out of abilities, can be knocked out of doing certain spells and all of that. So use the fact that the enemy will target the character that you are using to your advantage. Use that time. Also, regarding Barret, you should charge Barret's attack once he empties his mag. Once he pretty much shoots and reloads automatically, that's when you should also hit the charge button, because you shouldn't do it in the middle of shooting, because that messes up the rhythm. And the last shot on before Barret reloads does a little bit more damage. It does a little bit more stun. It impacts the enemy more. So you want to make sure you just like release his full mag and then charge. It just flows really well. And the last thing, the tip I really have is in 1v1 scenarios when it comes to countering. Later in the game, you will get an ability called Counter Stance, which is pretty much like a command, and it's just an ability that you can command a counter. Other than that, you have to counter by going into Cloud's Punisher mode. Don't be ashamed or afraid in certain scenarios, one-on-one scenarios or whatever scenario, to just sit there and go into Punisher mode and sit there and hold L1 and wait for the enemy to attack. There is nothing wrong with that. If you want to exploit it that way, wait for the enemy to attack and Cloud will counter them every single time, as long as it's like a basic physical attack and it's not like a grapple or something like that. If it's a physical, pretty much straight on physical attack, Cloud will counter it. Also, what I recommend is attacking within his basic stance. I believe it's called the operator stance. Attack in the operator stance, and then switch into Punisher stance after a few hits in his operator stance, because eventually the enemy is going to attack right after you hit them a few times. So after a few attacks, a few quick strikes, switch to the Punisher mode and then hold R1, and then you will be ready to counter. Countering is easy. All you do is sit there in Punisher mode and hold R1. Also, some people don't know that, so even though after you do a counter in Punisher mode, sometimes it doesn't stop the enemy from attacking. You will counter, but it doesn't stop them from doing a continuous attack. After you do a counter, after the counter is performed, you can go right back into Punisher mode and hold R1. So Cloud can do continuous counters. It's not just one thing and then you have to block or attack. You can go back into Punisher mode. usually as long as there's like some type of gap in the enemy's attack, and usually there is. So that's pretty much, you know, the tips I really have for newcomers to the Final Fantasy combat system. But like I said, the most important thing is establishing like that flow and rhythm of attack, fill ATB bar, and then use an ability. Rely on your abilities more than anything else. Okay, materia, like I said, is very situational, depending to exploit a weakness, strength, to debuff or heal. And like I said, don't stick around on a character for too long. This game is really meant for you to switch a lot and take advantage of that. I know that that doesn't seem great at first, but you will learn to kind of do it properly and maximize your time with it. So those are my tips. Let me know what y'all think about this, and if you have any other tips for this combat system because you've played it that I didn't mention, because there is plenty I didn't mention, of course. This is just basic stuff. Then yeah, definitely write them in the comment section. I didn't mention much use of items. I recommend you become very proficient in using like spells and your abilities, because especially if you plan to play the game on hard, you can't use items at all. So learn to manage your MP and learn to use and rely on your abilities. Learn which abilities do the most stagger, build the most stagger bar and everything like that, such as Tifa's Unbridled Strength, which also increases the percentage of damage they take while staggered, and you know, Cloud's Cloud's thrust does a lot of stagger, and Barrett's overcharge does his overcharge, but also his focus shot does a lot of stagger bar build also. So like I said, if y'all have any more tips for people who could use it in the comment section, let me know. And yeah, I'll check y'all in the next video. I'm out of here. Peace.